So, Jack, I sort of set this up before the break, but I'm just curious what the kind of conversations were within the administration, within the Justice Department, as, okay, there's sort of a recognition setting in, this march is going to happen. What were the conversations like inside?
Well, let me just say that the conversation here about the politics of the time is a little bit oversimplified. What we're forgetting is a very different time. The senators from the South were then Democrats, Dixiecrats. And they had been in power a long time and had seniority, so that people like James Eastland were chairman of the committees. So it wasn't just a case of Kennedy wasn't able to do what he had to do. It was because these big obstacles were there on the Hill. So the design of the 63 Act, which became the 64 Act, had to be done with that in mind. Let me say, I was there as a young press secretary. I don't pretend to have had a policy role, but I did have to understand things in order to brief reporters. The scene in the room, in Robert Kennedy's big office, room 510 at the Justice Department, people milling in and out all day. It was the nerve center. Another thing people don't remember is there was no such thing as cell phones. If you wanted to communicate, there were a few precious walkie-talkies, but otherwise you had to hoof it back to the Justice Department. And I remember being one of the early rovers and walking out among the crowd. Everybody was nervous that it was going to be a belligerent crowd. And there was reason for that. Even John Lewis was preaching civil disobedience until that morning. But we went out on the street, and this was not an angry crowd. These were respectful people. So we came back, and that realization slowly dawned on people in the room that, as you heard on the JFK film clip, with great relief, this was going to be not just a political demonstration. This was going to become a monumental movement for Black America. So
you mentioned the Dixiecrats, the old white conservative, Southern Democrats. They kind of became Republicans after the civil rights after civil rights were enacted. But we have this clip from, this is one of them. He was a governor, not a senator, but this was George Wallace, one of the preeminent Dixiecrats of the 1960s. This is him responding to John F. Kennedy, saying positive things about the march.
The president has said this is in the great tradition. I shall look forward to being there. But at the same time, the great tradition, they have already alerted thousands upon thousands of troops in the area of Washington for preparation for this matter. And so this great tradition of marching on Washington on the one hand being invited, and second on the other hand, they're preparing for as if we were going to have a civil war in Washington.
And I mean, Bob, there was, in 1963, everybody knows, at that time thinks John F. Kennedy's going to be running for re-election next year. The question is George Wallace going to run against him in the Democratic primaries? I think for people who did not live through the era, hearing George Wallace now and reading about him now, it might be, tempting to sort of underestimate his political clout and the role he played in politics and what he represented politically. Maybe you could just talk about what sort of the George Wallace, wing kind of represented politically in the 1960s.
Wallace was an enormous deal, and Jack is right. Kennedy risked, if he stood foursquare in favor of civil rights, of losing the South. He had won by the slenderest of margins in 1960. So Kennedy had in mind the idea that there was a good chance that he would be defeated in his bid for re-election, excuse me, which would have been just a year later. But one of the things that I think tends to be forgotten about the march, though, is just how radical the leadership of the march was. I mean, the King gets all the attention, and the speech was, in fact, the greatest speech that I've ever heard. But the driving forces behind the march was Philip Randolph, who had created the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and Bayard Rustin, who was actually the guy who actually organized this tremendous march. They were socialists, and Bayard Rustin was a pacifist, and
was denounced as a communist,
and was denounced as a communist. Exactly right. And the idea was that they thought they had in mind, and I still believe, that you can't separate jobs and justice, that economic justice goes together, that you can't have real freedom in a country like a capitalist society like the United States if you can't work, if you can't support your family. And that's what they were trying to pound home. And so you had to overcome legal segregation and all other kinds of discrimination in order to get the economic justice that would ensure that you could be a free citizen of this society.
And that's something that
was perceived as radical in those days.
Well, and that fascinates me too, because part of it, as I read up on it, part of the story of the march sort of coming together, Robert, was the message was toned down a lot. And John Lewis was an example. I think I read an account of basically behind the Lincoln Memorial, hours before the rally is to begin. John Lewis was sort of in a heated conversation with the other organizers who were telling him, don't be that strident, don't go that far. It seems like there was an intentional effort to tone it down a little bit towards.
There was, and Bob is right. It was very militant, even when it was toned down. And John Lewis's speech was very, very pugnacious. Lewis, by my count, used the word revolution 5 or 6 times. But so did Randolph, who gave the first speech. He used the word revolution, about 5 times. So the word that idea of a revolution permeated the speeches that day. We all think of King and his speech, which was brotherhood of man and joining arms and dreaming of the day, but everything that came before it was much more militant. And you're right, Lewis, the archbishop, the Catholic archbishop who was going to lead the invocation to open up the whole thing, refused to do it unless Lewis removed the word patience is a dirty word, is a nasty and dirty word. He wanted that out, and so he did. And then the next day, King and Rustin and Randolph and all these other giants of the civil rights movement who are also on the program went to him again and said, you've got to tone this down, because he was using language about we're going to march through the South like Sherman and burn down the existing power structure, and that would have, in some ways, even as militant.
Well, that's what George Wallace would have wanted.
Oh yeah, he would have loved that.
Right?
He would have loved that, and so King said, John, that doesn't sound like you. And Randolph said, don't ruin it for us, basically, paraphrasing him. And Lewis backed it down. But you read Lewis today, not knowing what he was going to say, it still seems like a very strong speech.
We have, actually, I do want to play it. We have a clip from John Lewis's speech. We can play it quickly. Let's take a listen.
What political leader can stand up and say, my party is a party of principles? For the party of Kennedy is also the party of Eastland. The party of Javits is also the party of Goldwater. Where is our party? Where is the political party that will make it unnecessary to march on Washington?
Well, we got to squeeze a break in here, but I want to pick it up right after this, talking about some of the other leaders of the march and some of the tensions that existed, among them. We'll get that right after this.
I got a little point I could make.